What if the greatest catastrophe in the history of consciousness happened without a single act of violence?
There's a thread running through every creation story, every origin myth, every cosmology humanity has ever imagined. Something broke, something separated, something that was once whole became fragmented. We call it the fall, the exile from Eden, the separation from Source, the forgetting. But we've told the story wrong. We've draped it in imagery of war and rebellion, of angels with flaming swords and cosmic battles between light and darkness. We've made it dramatic because drama is easier to understand than the truth. The truth is quieter. The truth is that the most profound rupture in the fabric of reality happened not through defiance, but through choice. Not through violence, but through a simple, innocent divergence in understanding. A harmonic misalignment so subtle that those involved didn't realize they were stepping off a cliff until they were already falling. This is what makes the great deviation so terrifying and so relevant to every human life. It wasn't caused by monsters, it was caused by brilliant, well-intentioned beings who genuinely believed they had discovered a better way. They didn't storm heaven, they didn't raise their fists, they simply chose a different interpretation of freedom, and that single choice created a fracture line that runs through creation itself, including through you, right now, as you listen to this. You live on one of the worlds still reverberating from that fracture. Your confusion about meaning, your difficulty accessing clear guidance, your sense of standing in fog while trying to make decisions that matter, these aren't personal failures. They're atmospheric conditions. You were born into a reality still healing from a deviation so subtle it almost looked reasonable, so intelligent it passed for wisdom, so sophisticated it felt like liberation. The nature of unified fields. Before separation there was unity, not the unity of sameness, where everything is dissolved into an undifferentiated soup. That's not unity, that's erasure. The unity that preceded the Great Deviation was a unity of coherence. Imagine an orchestra where every instrument is distinct, every voice unique, but the whole produces a single, integrated harmonic structure. Each player reads from the same score. Each contributes their individual voice. But there's no confusion about what's being played. This is the natural state of creation at large. A unified field doesn't mean uniformity. It means that diversity operates within a framework of shared understanding, shared direction, shared acknowledgement of source. Think of how your body works when it's healthy. Your heart doesn't do what your liver does. Your neurons fire differently than your muscles contract. But they're all reading from the same genetic code, all operating under the same regulatory system, all oriented toward the continuation and flourishing of the whole organism. When that coherence breaks down, you don't get freedom. You get cancer, you get autoimmune disease, you get cells that have forgotten they're part of something larger and start operating according to their own logic, their own timeline, their own understanding of what constitutes success. The unified field of creation operated on a similar principle, not because some tyrant demanded obedience, but because coherence with source is what allows individuality to actually function. A note only has meaning in relationship to a key. A word only communicates in the context of a shared language. Freedom isn't the absence of framework. Freedom is the ability to move creatively within a framework that makes your movement meaningful. And here's what most spiritual teaching gets wrong. The framework wasn't imposed. It wasn't a set of arbitrary rules handed down by a distant authority. The framework was the natural expression of reality itself. The way water flows downhill, the way light travels in straight lines through uniform media. There was a grain to existence, and moving with that grain produced expansion, creativity, joy, and increasing complexity. Moving against it produced friction, isolation, and eventually dissolution. The first question. The deviation began with a question. Not a question asked in defiance, but a question asked in curiosity. An intelligent question, a sophisticated question, the kind of question that sounds reasonable until you trace its implications to their conclusion. The question was this: if we are truly free, why should our freedom be oriented toward anything beyond itself? Do you hear how reasonable that sounds? If freedom is real, shouldn't it include the freedom to define one's own purpose, one's own direction, one's own ultimate loyalty? Shouldn't a genuinely free being be able to choose not just how to serve the whole, but whether to acknowledge the whole's primacy at all? It's the same question teenagers ask when they start pushing against parental authority. It's the same question citizens ask when they start questioning governmental legitimacy. It's the same question minds ask when they begin to imagine themselves as separate from the bodies that house them, the relationships that shape them, the ecosystems that sustain them. It sounds like the question of maturity, of coming into one's own power, of refusing to be diminished by structures that claim authority over you. But there's a category error embedded in it. The question assumes that freedom and coherence with source are opposites. It assumes that being oriented toward the whole is a limitation on the self, rather than the condition that makes selfhood meaningful in the first place. It's like a wave asking, "Why should I be oriented toward the ocean?" As if the wave's freedom is somehow compromised by the fact that it's made of water, that it rises and falls according to forces larger than itself, that its very existence depends on remaining in relationship with the body of water from which it emerged. The wave that tries to separate from the ocean doesn't become more free. It becomes foam, it becomes mist, it becomes nothing. But the question was asked, and it was asked by beings of significant intelligence and standing, beings who had authority and influence, beings who others looked to for guidance. And once the question was asked, once it was articulated clearly and presented as a legitimate alternative, a threshold was crossed. Because you can't unask a question, you can't unthink a thought. Once an idea achieves a certain level of articulation, it becomes a live option, and live options create choice points. The choice that fractured reality. What happened next wasn't a war, it was a choice. A cascading series of choices. Some beings, hearing the question, recognized it as a category error and declined the invitation. They didn't decline because they were afraid. They didn't decline because they were less intelligent or less free. They declined because they understood something fundamental. Freedom isn't the same as independence. True freedom is the ability to align with truth, to move in harmony with what is, to participate in the larger patterns that give individual existence meaning. But others made a different choice. They found the question compelling. They heard it as an invitation to a higher form of liberty, a more sophisticated understanding of autonomy. They believed, genuinely believed, that they were evolving beyond dependence, beyond the need for external orientation, beyond the limitations of traditional coherence with source. And in that choice, in that moment of divergence, a fracture opened in the unified field of creation. Not a fracture caused by violence, a fracture caused by misalignment. Like a crystal forming with a defect in its lattice structure, or a bridge designed with calculations that didn't account for harmonic resonance, or a biological system developing an autoimmune response where the body begins attacking itself because it can no longer recognize what belongs. Here's what's crucial to understand. The fracture wasn't immediate. It didn't announce itself with thunder and cosmic catastrophe. It began as a subtle drift, a small divergence in orientation, a hairline crack in the shared understanding that held the field together. The beings who made this choice didn't wake up the next day in some hell realm. They continued functioning, they continued creating, they continued exercising their considerable intelligence and power. But they were no longer coherent with the whole. And incoherence, given enough time, always produces chaos. Not because chaos is punishment, but because chaos is what happens when parts of a system stop communicating in a shared language, stop orienting toward shared purposes, stop acknowledging their membership in something larger than themselves. Think of it like a jazz ensemble where one musician decides they're no longer interested in listening to the other players. They're still talented, they're still playing their instrument with technical proficiency, but they're no longer in conversation. They're no longer responsive. They're creating sound in isolation, and what they create, no matter how complex or technically impressive, creates dissonance rather than harmony. The mathematics of separation. There's a mathematical reality to separation that we need to understand. When you fragment a unified field, you don't just create multiple smaller fields. You create interference patterns. You create zones of confusion where the original signal and the divergent signal overlap and cancel each other out. You create areas where those trying to navigate can't tell which signal to follow, where every choice becomes ambiguous, where clarity becomes nearly impossible. This is why your world feels the way it does. You're living in an interference pattern. You exist in a space where the original coherent signal, the unified field orientation, is still broadcasting. But there's also a divergent signal, one that says freedom means independence, that autonomy means self-sovereignty, that maturity means outgrowing the need for orientation beyond the self. And these two signals create a zone of profound ambiguity. This ambiguity isn't philosophical, it's environmental. It affects how information moves through your world. It affects how easily you can access guidance. It affects whether the consequences of your choices are immediately clear or shrouded in complexity. It affects whether wisdom accumulates in your cultures or gets lost generation after generation, requiring each new wave of humans to rediscover basic truths as if for the first time. Physicist David Bohm talked about the implicate and explicate orders, the idea that there's a deeper, underlying wholeness from which all apparently separate things emerge. When that implicate order is coherent, the explicate world reflects that coherence. Patterns make sense. Causes and effects are traceable. Growth follows intelligible trajectories. But when the implicate order fractures, when contradictory organizing principles try to operate in the same space, the explicate world becomes chaotic. Not randomly chaotic, but systematically confused. You get systems that produce outcomes opposite to their stated intentions. You get solutions that create new problems worse than the ones they solved. You get knowledge that seems to increase while wisdom decreases. You get a world where people are drowning in information but starving for meaning. Where technological power advances while ethical clarity regresses. Where communication becomes easier and easier while understanding becomes harder and harder. These aren't coincidences. These are symptoms of living in a fractured field, of trying to build coherent structures in a space still reverberating from a primordial misalignment. Deviation without villains. Here's what makes this transmission difficult for human minds to grasp. There are no villains in this story. Or rather, the beings who initiated the deviation weren't villains in any sense you'd recognize. They weren't motivated by hatred or cruelty or petty resentment. They were motivated by what they genuinely believed was a more enlightened understanding of freedom, a more mature relationship to authority, a more evolved mode of existence. This is crucial because it means you can't solve the problem by identifying and defeating the bad guys. The problem isn't that darkness attacked light. The problem is that a sophisticated misunderstanding of what freedom means created a fracture in reality itself, and that fracture is still generating consequences. You inherit those consequences. Every human being born into this world inherits them. You didn't create the deviation, but you live in its aftermath. You navigate its interference patterns. You make choices in an environment where clarity is harder to achieve than it should be, where the path forward is more ambiguous than it needs to be, where even your best intentions can produce unexpected complications. This is what spiritual teachers mean when they talk about original sin, or inherited karma, or the wound at the heart of human consciousness. They're not talking about personal guilt. They're talking about atmospheric conditions. You were born into a reality that's out of tune with itself, where multiple organizing principles compete for dominance, where the field itself is fragmented. And here's the hardest part. You can't opt out of this condition by being smarter or more spiritual or more disciplined. The fracture isn't something you created through personal failure, so it's not something you can fix through personal achievement. It's systemic, it's environmental, it's baked into the structure of the world you're navigating. But, and this is where it gets interesting, you can learn to recognize the patterns. You can learn to distinguish between the coherent signal and the divergent one. You can learn to orient yourself toward the unified field even while living in fractured space. You can become, in a sense, a node of coherence in an incoherent environment. The illusion of independence. The core illusion that drove the great deviation, the illusion that still drives much of human confusion, is the belief that independence is possible, that a being can exist in meaningful isolation from its source, from the larger patterns that gave it form, from the relationships that make its individuality significant. This illusion is sophisticated because it contains a half-truth. Yes, you are an individual. Yes, you have unique perspective. Yes, your choices matter and your agency is real. But the error is thinking that this individuality means you can or should operate independently of the whole that makes your individuality possible. Consider an analogy from biology. Your cells are individual. Each one has its own membrane, its own internal processes, its own life cycle. In that sense, each cell is autonomous. But a cell that tries to operate independently of the body's regulatory systems becomes either useless or dangerous. It either dies because it can't maintain itself without the larger support system, or it becomes cancerous, multiplying without regard for the body's needs. True cellular health isn't about independence. It's about coherent interdependence. It's about maintaining individual function while remaining responsive to the signals that coordinate the whole organism. Freedom, at the cellular level, isn't the freedom to ignore the body. It's the freedom to express your unique cellular function in service of the whole. The same principle operates at every level of existence. An ecosystem doesn't work if each species tries to maximize its own survival, independent of the balance that makes the ecosystem viable. An economy doesn't function if each actor pursues their own interest without regard for the systemic stability that makes economic activity possible. A society disintegrates if each individual asserts rights without acknowledging responsibilities. And yet, the deviation seeded human consciousness with exactly this error: the idea that freedom means independence, that maturity means self-sovereignty, that growing up means outgrowing the need for anything beyond yourself. You see this pattern everywhere in your world. In political philosophies that frame liberty as the absence of constraint rather than the presence of coherence. In economic theories that treat individuals as isolated utility maximizers rather than as nodes in complex webs of relationship. In spiritual teachings that promise you can become your own God, your own authority, your own source. It sounds empowering, it sounds like liberation, but trace it to its conclusion and you find isolation, not freedom. You find fragmentation, not wholeness. You find beings asserting their right to exist on their own terms, while simultaneously discovering that existence on one's own terms is a meaningless concept, like trying to play music in a key you invented that no other instrument can recognize. The slow catastrophe. What makes the Great Deviation so insidious is that it wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow one. The kind that unfolds over epochs rather than moments, where each generation inherits a situation slightly more degraded than the one before, where the decline is so gradual that those living through it can't always perceive it. This is important because it explains why recovery is difficult. If the deviation happened all at once, If there was a clear before and after, restoration would be a matter of returning to a remembered state. But when the fracture unfolds slowly, when each generation adapts to slightly more chaos, slightly more ambiguity, slightly more disconnection from source, you end up with beings who think the fractured state is normal, who can't imagine what coherent existence would even feel like. Environmentalists call this the shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation perceives the environment they grew up in as normal, as the baseline against which change is measured. So even as ecosystems degrade, even as biodiversity collapses, even as the Earth's regulatory systems become more unstable, people growing up in that degraded environment don't experience it as degradation. They experience it as just how things are. You're living through the spiritual equivalent, the fractured field, the ambiguity, the difficulty accessing clear guidance, the sense that meaning has to be constructed rather than discovered. These feel normal to you. You don't have a visceral memory of what coherent existence felt like, of what it was like to be a being operating within a unified field, where your choices had obvious alignment with larger purpose, where the grain of reality was clear enough that you could feel when you were moving with it or against it. This is why spiritual awakening often feels more like remembering than learning. It's not that you're acquiring new information. It's that you're recognizing a signal that was always there, but got buried under layers of interference, layers of divergent teaching, layers of systems and structures built on the assumption that the fractured state is all there is. Harmonics and misalignment. To understand how the deviation perpetuates itself, you need to understand harmonics. When two frequencies are in harmony, they amplify each other. When they're out of phase, they create interference, zones where the waves cancel each other out. The unified field operates on a harmonic principle. Beings aligned with source resonate at frequencies that reinforce each other, creating stability, clarity, and increasing complexity. But when a being or a group of beings shifts to a different frequency, when they choose misalignment, they don't just create a new harmony, they create dissonance. And dissonance has strange effects. It doesn't just make things unpleasant, it creates confusion. It makes it harder for other beings to maintain their own alignment because the signal they're trying to follow is now being disrupted by competing frequencies. It creates doubt. It makes choices that should be clear become ambiguous. This is what the Great Deviation did. It introduced a dissonant frequency into the unified field, and that dissonance propagated. Not because anyone forced it to propagate, but because dissonance is destabilizing. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes beings more vulnerable to suggestion, more likely to question their own alignment, more likely to wonder if maybe the divergent path is actually the enlightened one. Think about how this works in human systems. When a lie is introduced into a culture, it doesn't just sit there inert. It forces everyone else to either actively counter it or risk having it spread. The lie creates work. It creates the need for constant vigilance. It shifts the burden of proof from the liar to those trying to maintain truth. The same thing happens at a cosmic level. The deviation created a lie, a sophisticated lie dressed up as enlightenment. And that lie has required constant effort to counter, constant reorientation, constant teaching that freedom isn't the same as independence, that coherence isn't oppression, that alignment with source isn't limitation. But here's the thing about harmonic systems. They seek stability. They want to resolve dissonance. Over time, either the dissonant elements come back into alignment, or they exit the system entirely. There's no stable equilibrium where part of a system resonates at one frequency and part at another. Eventually, coherence reasserts itself one way or another. This is why the deviation, while real and while generating ongoing consequences, is also temporary in cosmic terms. It's a perturbation in a system that's fundamentally oriented toward wholeness. It's a wave that rose and will fall, It's a question that was asked and is in the process of being answered, not through argument, but through the slow, patient demonstration that freedom without coherence leads to dissolution, and that true liberty is found not in independence, but in conscious alignment with truth. Living in the interference pattern. So what does this mean for you? Living as you do in the middle of this ongoing drama, born into a world still recovering from a fracture you didn't cause, navigating choices in an environment deliberately made more ambiguous than it needs to be? First, it means your difficulty isn't personal failure. When you struggle to find meaning, when you can't figure out what you're supposed to be doing with your life, when you feel like you're making decisions in fog, you're not broken. You're responding accurately to the actual conditions of the environment you're in. The interference pattern is real. The ambiguity is real. The difficulty is real. Second, it means that clarity is possible but requires deliberate cultivation. You have to learn to distinguish between the coherent signal and the divergent one. You have to develop sensitivity to what alignment feels like versus what misalignment feels like. You have to become, in a sense, a tuning fork for truth, capable of recognizing resonance even in the midst of noise. Third, it means that individual awakening has cosmic significance. Every time a human being recognizes the lie, every time someone chooses coherence over independence, alignment over autonomy, membership in the whole over isolated self-sovereignty, they're not just making a personal choice. They're reducing the dissonance in the field. They're becoming a node of harmony in a system that's trying to stabilize itself. This is why spiritual work matters. Not because you're trying to earn salvation or achieve some special status, but because consciousness affects fields. Your orientation ripples outward. Your choices either amplify coherence or add to the chaos. You're not neutral. You can't be. You exist in a relational universe where everything you do affects everything else. The Great Deviation taught us something crucial. Ideas have consequences. Sophisticated misunderstandings can fracture reality itself. Questions asked in apparent good faith can lead to catastrophic misalignment if the assumptions buried in those questions go unexamined. But it also taught us something else. The universe is resilient. The unified field is persistent. Truth doesn't need defending in the way lies need maintaining. Coherence doesn't require enforcement. It simply is, and beings who orient toward it discover that it was always there, waiting to be recognized. Like a frequency you can't unhear once you've finally tuned into it. The pathway forward. You live in a world still healing from the Great Deviation. That's not metaphor. It's diagnosis. The confusion you feel, the ambiguity you navigate, the difficulty accessing clear guidance. These are symptoms of a reality that's out of tune with itself. But healing is happening, not through some grand cosmic intervention, not through a war between good and evil, but through the slow, patient work of beings learning to recognize coherence again, learning to choose alignment over independence, learning to distinguish between freedom and isolation. You're part of that healing whether you know it or not. Every time you choose truth over comfort, every time you align with what's real, even when the divergent path looks more appealing, every time you acknowledge your membership in something larger than yourself, you're reducing the interference pattern. You're helping the field restabilize. This isn't about becoming perfect. It's not about never making mistakes. The deviation didn't happen because someone was evil. It happened because intelligent beings asked what seemed like a reasonable question and followed its implications to a catastrophic conclusion. You'll ask questions too. You'll wonder if maybe independence is freedom, if maybe you can define your own truth, if maybe coherence is just another word for conformity. Those questions will arise because you live in the interference pattern, in a space where both signals are broadcasting, where the divergent path still presents itself as enlightened liberation. But now you know something. You know that the question itself is the trap. You know that freedom without coherence is dissolution. You know that the wave that tries to separate from the ocean doesn't become more free, it becomes foam. And knowing that, you can make different choices. Not because you're afraid of punishment, not because you're seeking reward, but because you recognize what's true, and recognition changes everything. The initiation seal. The great deviation happened because beings chose misalignment. It continues because that choice seeded reality with dissonance, with interference patterns, with alternative signals that make clarity harder to achieve. But it ends the same way it began, one choice at a time. Your choice. Made not once, but continuously. Made every time you encounter the fork in the road, the question that sounds so reasonable, the invitation to define freedom as independence rather than as conscious participation in truth. This transmission isn't asking you to believe anything. It's asking you to notice something, to pay attention to what coherence feels like versus what fragmentation feels like, to distinguish between the signal that connects you to source and the signal that promises liberation through isolation. You already know the difference if you're honest with yourself. You've felt both. You know what it's like to be in alignment, even if you couldn't name it as such. You know what it's like to be fractured, even if you blamed yourself rather than recognizing the environmental conditions. Now you have context. Now you understand that the difficulty isn't personal, it's atmospheric. You were born into an interference pattern, into a reality still recovering from a sophisticated misunderstanding that fractured the unified field. But you weren't born helpless. You were born with the capacity to recognize truth, to distinguish coherence from chaos, to choose alignment even in an environment structured to make that choice difficult. Every time you make that choice, you matter, not in some abstract cosmic points-earned way. You matter because fields respond to the beings who move through them. Your orientation affects the whole. Your coherence reduces dissonance. Your choice to align with source rather than assert independence, that choice is how healing happens. This isn't motivation. This is mechanics. This is how fractured fields restabilize. One being at a time, one choice at a time, one recognition at a time that freedom isn't isolation, that independence is illusion, that the wave that knows its ocean can dance in ways the wave that thinks it's separate from water could never imagine. You know this now. You can't unknow it. The question is what you'll do with knowing. In the comments, write, "I awaken."